Hey everyone, this is Mrs. King, and we're going to get started with the respiratory system day 2 here. And I think I finally got my system going here, so we shall see. Anyway, we left off yesterday after talking about the respiratory tree from the nares down to the bronchioles and the alveoli. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the lungs, and of course we have two lungs, and it stands to reason that the right lung is larger than the left because the heart sits more on the left. There are actually 3 lobes on the right and 2 lobes on the left, and each lobe is actually divided up into segments that you'll be learning about in your higher level anatomy classes. Now, if you look at the lungs, and I've got a picture coming up on the next slide, both the lungs are cone-shaped. They come to kind of a point. They call it an apex at the top, and it's rounded off. And then the base of the lungs are convex, or concave, I'm sorry, to fit on the convex surface of the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a large domed muscle that divides the thorax from the abdomen, and the lungs sit right on top of the diaphragm. And within the lungs we have 3 million plus little alveoli that are there for air exchange, and as life goes on, they start to break down, of course, with smoking and air pollution, that these little alveoli burst and rupture and become bigger and bigger alveoli instead of the little teeny ones. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about diseases of the lung. But it's really important to understand that the lungs need to be very spongy. That will allow them to stretch out a little bit in the process of respiration, and they have something called compliance. They must be compliant. They must be able to be stretched a bit. So here's a picture of rabbit lungs, and it's actually hooked up to the heart in between the 2 lungs, but you can see that you just want to touch it. It would be nice and spongy appearing, and it's nice and pink and red, and it means it's well oxygenated. So those are healthy lungs. You can see they come to kind of the point, the apex at the top, and you can see the rounded convex surface at the bottom, at least of that left lung there. So now we're going to talk about the mechanics of breathing, and it's really important to understand that we actually have air flowing in, that we don't actually suck air in. So the lungs lie within the thoracic cavity. Thoraco, of course, means chest, and it is important to maintain a sealed system within the chest. We have to have a vacuum there in order to breathe. Now, this system that we have to allow us to breathe has to have certain components that are intact. So we have to have a rib cage. We have to have muscles between the rib cage. We have what we call the external intercostals and the internal intercostals. We have the diaphragm at the base of the thorax, and this is that dome-shaped muscle that separates the abdomen from the chest, as I had mentioned before. And then we have the lungs themselves, and then the other thing that's very important are called the pleural membranes. We'll talk more about that right now. So these pleural membranes are very specialized membranes. There are 2 of them. One lies directly on the outside of the lung, and that's why we call it the visceral, meaning internal organ, the visceral pleura, and it lies directly on the lung. Then there is a second layer of this membrane called the parietal pleura, and this membrane lines the lung cavity itself. So these 2 membranes lie side by side, and there's a small amount of fluid within the space between the 2 to decrease the friction. But there is a negative pressure found between these two membranes within the intrapleural space, and that becomes very, very important to help us to breathe. Now, blood is circulating around the body, and as it passes through the respiratory center, which is in the medulla of the brain, and that's in the brain stem, and the blood is circulating around, and the medulla recognizes that there is a high level of carbon dioxide in the blood, and that's what actually triggers us to take a respiration, is the higher CO2 versus a low oxygen. I think most of us assume that when the oxygen level gets a little bit low, that makes us breathe. That's not the case. It's actually carbon dioxide level rising that makes us want to take a breath. So we actually have two phases of respiration. The first one is inspiration, and that's the active phase of our breathing. And what happens here is that the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm contract. So when that happens, when the intercostal muscles contract, it actually raises the rib cage up. And when the diaphragm contracts, it actually moves downward. And so by doing that, it increases the size of the thoracic cavity inside the chest cavity. So that whole cavity increases in size. Now when that happens, the lungs follow right along with the chest wall with this intact vacuum system. And what happens then is that the pressure actually drops within the lungs. And when that happens, the atmospheric pressure is greater on the outside of us than it is in the lungs, and so the air rushes in. It comes in over a pressure gradient, so it comes in by diffusion, so it automatically flows in. We actually don't, take in air per se. It flows in over this pressure gradient from higher pressure to lower pressure. So to just review this again, the chest cavity expands when the external intercostals contract and the diaphragm contracts. So that makes the thoracic cavity bigger. When that happens, the lungs follow right along with the expanding cavity because of the negative pressure between the two pleural membranes. And so when that happens, the pressure drops within the chest cavity, within the lungs. And so air flows in because the atmospheric pressure, I think it's 14.7 ATMs or 720 torr units. I think I recall something like that. Anyway, the air rushes in to the lungs. Now, expiration, normally when we're at rest, is passive, but when we are active, the diaphragm will relax and raise back up, and the external intercostals relax. And when we are breathing fast, actually we have another set of intercostal muscles called the internal intercostals, and they actually will lower the rib cage so that we can breathe faster, and then the external will contract and the chest cavity will expand, and back and forth it goes. Now, when the rib cage gets smaller during expiration, the pressure in the lungs increase again, and it forces the air out because the pressure within the thoracic cavity is now greater than the outside, and so the air flows out. So it's actually because of the pressure differences within the chest that we breathe. Now here's a picture here, and you can see it doesn't say a lot, that the oxygen comes in, the diaphragm is lower, and on the picture on the right, the diaphragm rises up and the chest cavity gets smaller, and the carbon dioxide in the air that's in the lungs will be expelled. So we'll go over this in class tomorrow, and I'm also going to post for you some reading of the chapter that you can take a look at, and it'll maybe clarify any questions that you have. So this is external respiration that I've talked about, and we'll talk about internal respiration and cellular respiration tomorrow. Bye for now.